enjoy the rest of the weekend. My name is Christine Woody, and I am a policy coordinator for Empower Missouri. We're a statewide nonprofit organization that does advocacy and community education on a wide range of social welfare issues, including affordable housing, food security, and criminal justice. Today, like every month for many, many decades, we hold a Friday forum. Before COVID, we met in person in both St. Louis and Kansas City, where we'd bring folks together to talk about a specific topic that related to one of the issues that we are working on. Since COVID, everything is transferred online. And so we teamed up with Kansas City and have been putting on one educational Friday forum a month since probably March. So today we're going to be focusing on what's happening in Jefferson City and how it relates to each of us on our own local and personal level. Our overall theme for our spring forums have been that all politics are local. We focused on the hyper-local issues in February, and then we talked about the budget last month. And today we're going to focus on what is happening in Jefferson City, specifically how it relates to some issues that are very timely and very pointed to how it can affect each one of us individually. We're going to focus on some policing reforms, as well as what's happening with Medicaid expansion. And then we're going to just do kind of an overarching update on some other Empower Missouri priorities and where they stand and what we see happening for the next 6 weeks. The legislators are still working and they'll be there through mid-May. So we have about 6 weeks left of the legislative session. So I'm going to do just some quick introductions of our 3 panelists, and then I will let each of them speak, and then we can do some question and answer after that. So I want to first introduce Sarah Baker. She is the Legislative and Policy Director for the ACLU of Missouri. She has been with the ACLU. Actually, I don't have the date for when you started, Sarah. I was going to say how long you've been there.
Almost 5 years.
5 years, wonderful, thank you. She also spent some time in Washington, D.C., and she worked with at Washington University with some other organizations. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in International and Area Studies in Spanish, as well as a Master's of Arts in International Affairs. Both of those are from with Washington University. Next, we have Sean DeAbreu. He is the Policy Director based in Jefferson City with Missouri Healthcare for All. He's going to share us all the updates of what's happening right now with Medicaid expansion. And finally, we have Jeremy Lefevre. He was a former state representative. He is now currently with State Line Strategies, which is a lobbying firm, and we are working with him at Empower Missouri to do some lobbying work for us on our priority issues. So he is down in Jefferson City every day during session, working on a lot of the issues that Empower Missouri cares about, and he's going to give us kind of a lobbyist perspective of what's happening down there this session. So Sarah, if you want to start, and then we'll go to Sean, and then we'll finalize everything with Jeremy, and then we'll do some question and answers.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Christine, and thanks
thank you.
Thanks Empower community for putting this on every month. We appreciate it and love working with all of you. So my name's Sarah Baker. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the Legislative and Policy Director at the ACLU of Missouri. Like Christine said, I've been here for 5 years. So I got all of my gray hairs during the Trump administration working at this particular post. The ACLU works on a wide range of civil liberties issues. You can check out our website and look at our bill tracker for some of the different issues that we're working on this legislative session. But that really covers everything from LGBT rights to police reform, to criminal justice reform, to free speech issues, freedom of the press issues, search and seizure issues, all sorts of things that fall under the Bill of Rights. What I'm going to talk about specifically today is where we are on policing reform in the Missouri legislature. So you might remember at the beginning of session, there were several good police reform bills introduced. We are actually tracking 139 measures related to policing. Not all of those are good. Sorry to break hearts, but they're not. But there are some that offer hope on an otherwise very bleak horizon in Missouri. I know I don't need to tell people on this call, but I will reiterate, policing is very broken in our country, and it is particularly broken in the state of Missouri. We've been doing a vehicle stops report since 2001 that's again and again, year over year, revealed significant disparities in the way Missourians are policed across our state, with Black individuals being subject to stops at a rate that is 91% greater than their proportion of the population. And so that sort of racial bias in policing has led to a real need for reform in Missouri, not to mention all that's happened in the national context and what we're all going through right now with the trial surrounding accountability for the murder of George Floyd. So because of that effort, and particularly over the summer during the massive protests following the murder of George Floyd, we got together with several senators and representatives to work on a package of police reform. Around the table included folks from the police union, because you can't actually get anything done on policing in Missouri if you don't have them at the table. It's the so-called blue wall in Missouri. But also a lot of reform groups, including some input from Empower, including NAACP and others at the table. And what we worked on was SB 60, which is a bill that Senator Brian Williams introduced. And it was an omnibus piece of legislation that included a myriad of changes around chokeholds and banning chokeholds, around any no-knock warrants, around having increased accountability for officers. That bill got a very early hearing in the legislative session, which was a positive sign. Unfortunately, in the committee hearing, it was combined with a bill on police residency and removing requirements around police residency for officers in Kansas City. Then it became SB 53. So SB 53 includes some of the reform measures from Senator Williams' bill, particularly three things. It includes a ban on chokeholds. It includes provisions that would require more penalties for officers who engage in coercive sex on duty. And it would allow police chiefs to speak out more freely when they have a bad apple officer. But that bill did get merged with Senator Luke Meyer's bill that removes residency requirements for officers in Kansas City. So those officers could now live outside the city limits, which limits the ability to have community policing. So definitely a mixed bag moving out of committee. That bill has come up on the floor of the Senate. It has passed out of the Senate. When it passed out of the Senate, there was yet another felony charge added into that bill, particularly related to doxing of police officers. So this is when individuals threaten police officers by publishing personal information. Some might say, well, yeah, there should be penalties for that. There are already penalties for harassment. There are already enhancements for harassing officers. But what this bill does, this section of the bill does, is add such a vague provision around anyone who reveals personally identifying information of officers that it could really entrap a lot of folks who are on this call, who engage in protests and community and might say, you know, I object to Officer X who works at Station Y. That could be construed as personally identifying information. And so SB 53, which is the combo with 60, has gotten more controversial as it's moved through the process. It is now in the House. This week, we also saw debate on the floor of the House on House Bill 876, which is very similar to Senator Williams' bill, but it's sponsored by a Republican representative, Shamed Dogan from the Baldwin area. And this included legislation that would ban chokeholds, that would ban the coercive sex on duty, that would also include provisions that would allow police chiefs to speak out more. And on the floor of the House, they added procedures that would include a use of force reporting database and a rat back program where officers would have to be fingerprinted so that we would know if they were coming up in any sort of criminal cases and they could be identified and sorted out from the process so that community members wouldn't have to be policed by individuals who are themselves committing crimes. So that legislation took a doozy on the floor this week, which is it came up for debate. Things were going pretty well. And then there was a representative who offered an amendment that would have made it a hate crime would have included officers in the hate crime statute for Missouri. For individuals who aren't familiar with that, the hate crime statute is generally used for immutable characteristics like your gender, your sexual orientation, your race. By adding officers to that, it is one, very offensive to individuals who have some of those identities, who don't see an act of employment as being an immutable characteristic. And two, it carries real consequences for interactions between the community and police officers, because if you make it a hate crime to threaten an officer, that can be really misconstrued to threatening protests, to bringing charges against people and enhancements against people who might be construed as resisting arrest, all sorts of those things. So that amendment was offered. It was ultimately withdrawn after a very intense encounter between the sponsor of that amendment, Representative Cook, I believe, and Representative Bosley, who is a Black female representative from the St. Louis area, who spoke out and gave a very impassioned, I urge you to watch it if you've got time, very impassioned speech about why hate crimes for officers were inappropriate. Focused mostly on, has the government ever discriminated against you because of your employment as an officer? And then added to that, has the government ever considered you 3/5 of the person? It is an incredible speech, and you should definitely go back and watch that if you've got a chance. So she helped get that pulled off as an amendment on the floor. I hope people find this as interesting as I do, because I don't know, Jeremy and I live in this world of blow by blow on the floor of the House and Senate. So I hope it's interesting. And then Representative Hovis offered an amendment that really gutted the chokehold provision. And at that point, Representative Dogan made a decision to send the bill back to legislative review, which is a new creature in the world of the legislature. And it's a place where they can come up with a substitute that they will then present on the floor. And hopefully that substitute will have provisions in it that the bill sponsor, Representative Dogan, can continue to support. And hopefully we can move that one out of the House and get it. So lots of work being done there on police reform. I also wanted to bring up some of the threats to police reform in the state of Missouri. So I mentioned before that hate crime legislation, that's popped up in numerous places. And unfortunately, we've seen Democrats and Republicans alike voting for legislation that would either support a law enforcement bill of rights or would increase or would have hate crime charges go against individuals who threatened officers. The bill numbers for those are numerous, and I'm happy to give them at some other point. But for example, HB 74, for example, HB 898 are both pieces of legislation that would put hate crime charges in place should an interaction with an officer go south. Those are real threats to police accountability. The other package of things that threaten police accountability is the so-called Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. I know to a lot of folks, that sounds great. Everyone should have rights. I work for the ACLU. We firmly support the Bill of Rights. We just don't think you should get to have your own, totally separate from the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution. So the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights would add additional protections for officers that really free them from accountability. So one of the instances that I dislike most in that law is a provision that would require individuals who wish to complain about law enforcement officers to sign a sworn affidavit. Well, if you've already been in a position where you've been threatened by an officer to the point where you feel like you need to issue a complaint against that officer, you might not be in a place where you feel comfortable signing a sworn affidavit. And so we need to make sure that when we're talking about community policing and police accountability, we give the community a chance to hold the police accountable. And that seems to be the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, a real effort to give law enforcement rights beyond that which you and I have. There have been several amendments to that to water it down throughout the process. That's good, but fundamentally, I think we need to really support a framework that pushes for equal rights for all and certainly does not put officers above account. And so what are we looking for going forward? Well, we're looking for 876 to get across the line. We're working on modifications to Senate Bill 53 so that hopefully it can be a true reform measure versus what it is today. But going forward on police reform, there's so much to do. From banning no-knock warrants to ending civil asset forfeiture to ensuring that there's more use of force reporting and independent investigations of officer-involved deaths. So any of those topics that you all are interested in, I'm happy to go into more depth on and or talk about ways to advocate for those going forward in the legislature. But I hope this has been informative on where we are on police reform right now, and happy to take any questions when Christine opens it up for that. I don't want to cause chaos and anarchy in the Empower call. So thank you all for your time. I can't hear. Yep, mute.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah, you're
A quick question. Do you remember the day and roughly time of the Lakeisha Bosley engagement?
Let me look at my text messages, because I believe I exchanged a flurry around that particular incident. One moment, please.
I included a link to the archive video. So if folks want to go on that, there's a chat function on the thing. You can click on the link. Sean DeBria also included a link on there. And then
This
when
was on
Sarah,
Wednesday, and I'll get clearer on the time. Let me look through some of my messages and I'll pop that into the chat.
super. Thanks.
Does anyone have any questions for Sarah right now? We can take some questions if they're right on your mind, instead of waiting for the rest. I'm happy to do that.
My questions was regarding the legislative review. Is there a special committee for that, or is it just legislators are picked to review certain laws that are brought to them?
Great question. This is kind of a new thing, but it's a committee that's already designated, so I can drop the members of that in the chat. Generally, they're tasked with mostly like technical changes and cleanup, but in this instance, where they're being tasked with 876 is really making sure that the intent of the bill remains intact. And so I expect them to have a hearing early next week about that, and we'll see what substitute would come out of that committee. There's no public testimony taken during that committee hearing, but I can drop the members in the chat.
Thank you.
No problem.
And we can do more questions after everyone else is done. So if you think of anything else, we can have a further discussion at the end. But Sean, would you like to join and share some updates on Medicaid expansion?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Sean DeBria, Policy Director for Missouri Healthcare for All. There's a lot that's been going on with expansion, and so I'll try to put everything kind of in a nutshell, and then if there are other additional questions that are more policy focused in terms of what expansion does or whatever, then we can get to those during the Q&A. But this week, we saw kind of a continuation of the House's determination not to follow the will of the people that was expressed August 2020 when Missouri passed Medicaid expansion by 53%. The House Budget Committee, a week prior, had decided to not pass out a bill that it had crafted, House Bill 20, which took all of the various line items that would usually be in House Bill 11, which is the Medicaid budget for Department of Mental Health and also Department of Senior Services, took all of those line items that would be affected by the Medicaid expansion and put them in one standalone bill, which is House Bill 20. And then after a debate, basically, for a while in that committee, they voted down House Bill 20. So it failed to pass the Budget Committee. So therefore, the budget that went to the House budget, to the floor that we saw that debate this week, did not have Medicaid expansion anywhere in the budget. And so therefore, there was a big debate. As a matter of fact, there were two debates. One for the perfection vote, which basically when a bill leaves committee and comes to the floor, that perfection vote basically signifies that the chamber is willing for it to pass on to the Senate after another vote, the third read vote. And so in that perfection debate, there were a lot of arguments that were being made for and against Medicaid expansion. And I'll say this, there weren't really arguments on both sides. There was one side that was arguing the facts of Medicaid expansion in terms of the benefits of it to individuals, the fact that people that are now in the coverage gap, over 100,000 Missourians that are in the coverage gap where they make too much money for subsidies, or make too little money for subsidies and make too much money qualify for Medicaid, kind of caught in that gap, then those people would be taken out of that coverage gap and they would have access to health care. There were other arguments that were made that I'm sure that you all have heard before about how beneficial Medicaid expansion would be. Also, the fact that we are right now, and from a budgetary perspective, we are flush with cash was one of the terms that was used. We've never been in a position that we've been in since I've been working at the legislature, where we've had so many resources, both in terms of the revenues from the state, and Jeremy will be able to get more into that if we get into a Q&A, and also the federal dollars that are coming in, not only from the American Rescue Plan, but also funds that still remain unspent from the CARES Act. There's also enhanced reimbursements because of the public health emergency, and also FMAP reimbursement enhancements for the next at least year. So there are a lot of resources, and mostly folks on the Democratic side were making those arguments. On the opponent side, their arguments were not really made in good faith for the most part, and they were all over the place in their arguments. Many of them were saying we can't afford it. Well, right now we've never been in a better position to be able to afford whatever cost Medicaid expansion would incur to the state. We all know that Medicaid expansion, from the experience of other states, has really represented a net boon in just about every category you could name. And even in those states where there was a relatively small upfront cost, those were more than offset by the benefits of the program going forward. So those arguments related to not having enough resources were specious. There were also other things that were talked about in terms of wanting to protect the most vulnerable. I think one of the things that's really interesting, there are two things that are interesting about that argument right now. So one, in the governor's original budget, which we support because he incorporated Medicaid expansion within the regular budget bills that cover Medicaid. So House Bill 10, House Bill 11 with the Department of Mental Health and the Department of Senior Services. He included Medicaid expansion within the budget properly. And so we definitely support that. But one of the arguments that are made, and in that, he put in basically a cost of about $128 million, I think, that Medicaid expansion would cost. So being very conservative, quote unquote, in his estimations, with all the resources that we've already talked about, it's unlikely that that money would need to be spent in that way, or that it would be more than offset by the other resources that are coming into the state. Even though the House's position is that we cannot afford Medicaid expansion, what the House Budget Committee decided to do at the direction of the chairman was to take, and I think he estimated a lower cost of about 113 million. Jeremy can correct me if I'm wrong about that. And basically spend that in other places. So spent it on things that we all support and that we've been fighting for years. Helping home and community-based services, even helping give more resources to defense attorneys, et cetera. We all support all of those things, right? But it really undercuts the argument that we can't afford it if we're taking money that we say we don't have and put it in these other places, so that arguments can be made on the floor of the House that we are protecting the most vulnerable now. So again, I'm using these examples to illustrate that one side, and I would assume that all of us are on that side, one side really has the facts and also the moral high ground, and the opponents are really not operating in good faith at this point. So there were two different debates. They both happened for the perfection vote, and in the third revote, the House ultimately passed out the budget without Medicaid expansion, even though there were many amendments that were really trying to illustrate both the fact that this is something we need to do, and also give the House proper an opportunity to do the right thing. They failed to take advantage of that opportunity, and now Medicaid expansion issue as well as the budget goes over to the Senate. And so those bills will be first read in the Senate, and they'll go to the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so I'll stop right there with all the details. We can get more into kind of more procedures and what may be next. But right now, the locus of the conflict will be the Senate Appropriations Committee. And you should know that from my understanding, the conversations that I've had with senators and that many others have had, that there are many in the majority caucus who are more apt to support incorporating Medicaid expansion in the regular budget as it should be. There have been some stirrings about the Senate doing its own version of a House Bill 20, like a Senate bill, standalone bill. We would really highly encourage them to just simply put Medicaid, to go with the governor's recommendation and just put it inside the budget the way it ought to be. But yeah, so, you know, we want to encourage senators, particularly those that are on the Appropriations Committee, to give support to the chairman to incorporate Medicaid expansion in the budget as it should be. And one of the caveat that I will add to that, there are a group of senators that are called the Conservative Caucus, about, you know, 9 members of that. They kind of drop in and out, but they're a block that kind of, they see themselves as kind of the gatekeepers of all things conservative in many ways. They are probably not going to be convinced, even though some of them are from districts that voted in the majority for Medicaid expansion. And so those, you know, we should probably contact everybody, but those folks are probably less worth your time than the other senators in the chamber, particularly those that are on the Appropriations Committee, and reaching out to them. So I'll stop right there, and you know, if there are any questions or whatever, then I'll try my best to answer them.
There is a question in the chat. Sean, did you see that?
So if the state ignores the vote to expand, is there a way to sue the state to implement Medicaid expansion? And that's from Susan Ray. Short answer is yes. This will be, there are a lot of twists and turns here, a lot of possibilities. And so if the state decides not to, for instance, and this is kind of the worst case scenario, if the Senate across the board just says, well, we're just going to agree with the House and not expand Medicaid, that increases or the constitutional crisis that we're already in a sense. So when the House decided not to expand Medicaid expansion, that thrusts us into a constitutional crisis, in my opinion. If the Senate was to go along with that, then that plunges us deeper into that scenario. And it puts the governor in a very difficult position because constitutionally, as he understands it, as we all understand it, he is required to cover those people who will be eligible for coverage on July 1st. And so, you know, there are other options. There are, you know, special sessions and supplemental budget process that could be gone through. There are all kinds of possibilities. And so if that was to happen, that would immediately trigger some, you know, activities in the court to try to get movement on that. Exactly what those cases would look like, et cetera, I'm sure Sarah and Jeremy would be able to talk a little bit more about those. But right now, that's unclear. But what is unclear, what is clear is that there will be a lot of litigation related to this if the General Assembly fails to act.
My question is, who would be eligible to bring this to the courts? Would it have to be someone like ACLU, NAACP, or could it be individual citizens?
It kind of depends on.
Sure, and I think that that's
Go ahead.
and I'm not an attorney, so that might need to go to Sarah. But generally speaking, someone that
Yeah.
brings a case such as this has to show that they are harmed in some way, would be harmed. And so someone would need to have standing. And so who would have standing in that particular this particular circumstance? I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. So Sarah, you want to chime in on that, or
Jeremy was gonna speak to it, I think.
Jeremy?
So it kind of depends on how the governor handles it. And there's some folks that think that even if the legislature doesn't fund the expansion, and that's the important part, expansion happened. Medicaid is expanded. People are eligible for Medicaid come July 1. Now, whether the legislature chooses to fund that in this round of budgeting or not is kind of the question. But come July 1, according to the Constitution, somebody who is under 138% of the federal poverty level is eligible for Medicaid, will present at either a hospital or a clinic, or will apply through the Family Support Division for Medicaid. And at that point, the department then can say, yes, you qualify and you are enrolled, in which case nobody would sue. The funding then would come in a supplemental budget, which would drop, in January of 22. And in which case that would push the legislature to say, okay, are we going to fund a supplemental or are we not going to fund a supplemental? It seems to me like the governor is in a position to go ahead and say, yes, you are eligible for Medicaid. I don't think the legislature is not going to fund expansion. I think the Senate's going to win this fight. And so I think in the end it's going to happen. But even if they don't, somebody will present to the department will enroll them, and people will start paying for Medicaid.
Thank you, Jeremy. You're still good. You were my representative, and I'm glad to see you're still active.
I do my best. Thank you, Josephine.
And I apologize. Sarah is not an attorney, so she put that in the chat. So I apologize. I thought she was. So
No worries. I just surround myself with them. But yeah, I don't have anything to add to what Jeremy said. I am happy to know that lots of folks have eyes all over the litigation strategy, though, and we'll be supportive as we can.
there was also another question. I think Jeremy approached that from his perspective about which senators probably should not be contacted. I think things depend upon your capacity. So if your capacity as an advocate is to reach out to as an individual, if that person happens to be your representative or your senator, then sure, do that. If you're an organization that's really trying to, be careful about your resources, you want to target who you reach out to, then you should prioritize those folks in the Senate that are more likely to kind of listen to what you have to say, and then maybe go to those folks who are not, or who are less likely. That would be my opinion.
Do you know of any other states that have done this, where they've passed the legislation to actually expand it, but then have all this trouble with the budget side of things? I mean, have other states had this problem, or is this just a Missouri thing?
I'm not aware of any other state that's run into this. So
There aren't any. We're special.
Yes, we are. Jeremy, do you want to just continue on right now, and then we can go back and do other in-depth question and answer on things?
Yeah, of course. So just kind of, I was going to talk just a little bit about kind of the lay of the land in Jefferson City and kind of how the environment, I guess, that these issues come through, and then happy to take questions on a handful of things, maybe talk a little bit about some of the other Empower priorities that we're following. I will say on behalf of Empower, we're tracking more than 300 pieces of legislation, and just like Sarah said, some of them are good and most of them are not, but we're following a bunch, and so I'll try to touch on a handful of them. And then I've got some lists here with me, and we'll answer questions best I can. But it's been interesting for anybody who follows politics, certainly in the Kansas City area. People are sometimes aware of sort of the politics of Kansas and how it's operated on sort of a three-party system where you have Democrats, conservative Republicans, and then in Kansas they genuinely have what some term moderate Republicans. Missouri, that's never really been the case. They're kind of a split DNR, and then over the last decade or so, we've seen a growth in the Republican Party. And over the last couple of years, and I think it's going to continue this trend, there are becoming two parties within the majority party. And that is creating an environment where despite Democrats being in the smaller numbers, there are opportunities for Democrats to be very impactful and very effective. And so it forces coalitions and lobbyists and advocacy groups to form our coalitions with two out of those three factions. And then of course there's always, personality conflicts among people in power, because they've all got to, puff out their chests. And so there's this conflict between House leadership and the governor, and that creates some tension and some dynamic to set up battles where the fights are less Republican versus Democrat, and they turn into more Senate versus House, or whatever those two factions of coalitions are. We saw it this week with the biodiesel bill. There was a bill, I'm sure many of you have been following it, to impact trans athletes, children in youth sports, and Democrats and some conservative Republicans formed a coalition to the conservatives pledged they would stop pushing their anti-trans bills if the Democrats joined the conservative caucus and voted against biodiesel. And so there's all these sort of interesting things that go on in how you form your coalitions. So people like Sarah and I we're trying to count to 82. You need 82 votes to pass it in the House, or 18 in the Senate. And how can you form those coalitions of lawmakers to get there? But from this, the reason I bring this up is sometimes, and historically, I have, as a sort of center-left advocate, have felt, hopeless isn't the word, because I'm always hopeful, but I felt dejected from time to time. And this year I'm feeling enthusiastic more than I have in years past. One, like Sean said, we got a lot of money, and it's always fun to try to figure out how to spend money. But there's these new opportunities and leverage points to work with Democrats to be very impactful in the legislative process and the committee process. And so it's been good to see folks that sort of we agree with enhance their positions and level of influence. I think we saw that with some police reform with Senator Williams. I think, not 100% sure we got exactly where we wanted to with that bill, but there were opportunities to get there anyway. On some of the issues that are coming up, I want to talk a little bit about raise the age. I know that's important to a lot of people on this group. There was a bill that was passed a few years ago that would require 17-year-olds who were arrested to be processed in the juvenile court system instead of the adult court system. But there was a provision in that law that said unless an adequate amount, and I say that because it was the actual word, adequate amount of resources are appropriated to this program, the law shall not take effect. Well, nobody really understood what the word adequate meant. And so there have been jurisdictions or districts around the state that some of them are charging kids who are 17 as adults and some are not. And the juvenile officers have stayed pretty steady in their position, saying we need these resources appropriated in the budget so that these juveniles who have these issues, we can provide these wraparound services to make sure that juvenile doesn't come back and end up in the court system. And there was some back and forth. Well, finally this year, the governor included in his budget amendment $18 million to fund the services that the JOs, the juvenile officers, thought that they needed to enact that legislation. The House approved that in their last budget. My understanding is that Senator Huff and Senator Hegeman are both very supportive in the Senate as well. There's a companion piece of legislation sponsored by David Evans. He's from Howell County and down south, and David used to be a JO judge, and he's now the chair of Judiciary. He sponsored House Bill 1242, and that is working its way through the calendar. It's now been perfected in the House, and we're waiting a third read vote on that. And so it's moving forward, and the budget money is in there. There's some argument that is $18 million really the amount of money they needed, but at this point, like, there are so many parts of our budget that are so woefully underfunded that great. If you needed 18 million, here's your 18 million, spend it and help kids, I think is the idea. And so everybody seems to be groovy with how that's headed. We are tracking it very closely to make sure that nothing gets off track as that moves through. Some other good bills related to HIV. Senator Rader and Representative Krista Finelli have legislation, and I'm not as involved in this as I am in the PEP and PrEP bills. So maybe Christine or Sarah can hop on if folks have questions about that, but they're Senate Bill 65 and House Bill 755 are making their way through the process, and things seem to be going well. The PEP and PrEP bills, which would require or allow people to receive PEP and PrEP medication at the pharmacy without a prescription. There was some resistance in the Senate by the providers who don't like the idea of pharmacists prescribing. And so my understanding is they worked out some differences between Senator Razor and Senator Onder. That bill got voted out of committee. And then Representative Krista Finelli has companion legislation in the House, and that bill is in the Rules Committee waiting for the House floor. So they're a little behind schedule in terms of where, normally you'd want a bill at this stage of the game, and there aren't a lot of vehicles to throw it on. But we're still trying to push that through quickly. Did somebody have just a glitch in the thing? Oh, the SNAP bills. I was trying to talk about the good things first. The bad things. In particular, there's a number of pieces of legislation that would reduce the amount of supplemental nutrition assistance benefits, food stamps. It used to be called food stamps, now it's called SNAP. So there's legislation out there to reduce the amount of food stamps a family can get if the head of household doesn't comport with certain work requirements. There was also new legislation being heard to eliminate or reduce the amount of food stamps families can get if somebody isn't up to date in their child support payments. And I really tried with that one. I knew the sponsor wasn't genuinely trying to take food away from kids who already don't have enough because they're not being supported. But as much as I tried to understand it and look at it and hear the testimony, it's really that bad of an idea that it would take, if a parent is not providing child support to their child, the state will punish the family by taking away the amount of food they get. So that's a bad idea. The work requirements bills have a little more headway and have made it a little further than the other one. My guess is it'll get out of the House. They normally do, and it'll take a Senate filibuster to stop it. And I think we've got quite a bit of support among Senate Democrats and perhaps one or two Republicans willing to participate as well, but certainly Senate Democrats are willing to stop that. Sean kind of covered the budget and the Medicaid stuff. And then I know a lot less about police reform than Sarah does, so I won't even pretend. That's my story and I'm sticking to it. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Does anyone have any questions for any of our speakers? Yeah, Josephine, go ahead.
Okay, I'm glad to see from the budget that maybe the governor has gotten religion. But the things that I had to ask about that budget and the governor, how does he justify not using the money that was sent there to help cover COVID bills, and he still has it in his budget? How does he justify? And while you're also on that, you mentioned like he suggested 18 million or something for this project, and he suggested this. Does he have someone like a budget committee for him that kind of is almost accurate with these numbers, or do they just come up with numbers that they think that they should have? And I think those were the two questions I had about the governor. And the other one had to do with, I'm interested in maybe the discussion that went around the police living in Kansas City. And the other thing was there any, during that police discussion, anything said about this new movement, new old movement in Kansas City to get rid of the police chief? I know recently a lot of organizations, including my presbytery, has signed resolutions in order to get rid of the chief of police. And we all know about the board and all that stuff, but I was just wondering if there were any discussion.
I apologize, Josephine. I didn't write down each of those, and so I'm going to miss a couple.
The first one was about the governor, why he chooses not to spend the money, and how accurate are his numbers when he, in his budget, says so much for this and so much for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about in terms of spending the amount of money for CARES Act and those sorts of things. I know they're trying.
That there's money left over. That's what we have. Yeah.
There's always money left over at the end of the year that kind of goes unspent for a handful of programs. You just want to try to get to a policy point where you spend it as much as you can. In terms of like the folks that are he's got the Office of Budget or Office of Administration OA, and then Management and Budget within there. In terms of tracking like the CARES Act money, you bring up a good point, because I and the Missouri Budget Project, we've been trying to figure out how much is unspent with CARES Act money. And they did some tricky accounting through what they call journal vouchers to be able to use some of that CARES Act money to pay for staff expenditures from previously in the year. So I don't know 100% that they know exactly that, but I do know that the governor, Dan Hogg, who's the state budget director, is as good as it gets. I respect and appreciate him just as much as I did Linda Lubering, who worked under Governor Nixon. I mean, they are great people, smart folks who understand the budget really well. And so if Dan, through his analysis, thought that $18 million is what you needed for the JOs, then I'll believe it, I guess. So I think he does have great people that are advising him, and sometimes I agree with them and sometimes I don't. If that's helpful there.
Yeah, thank you.
And then on the policing question, that debate went well into the night, but what I do not remember, other than Senator Washington bringing it up, any discussion of Rick Smith. It was mostly around, there was certainly discussion about how this won't promote accountability, how it's very important for the residents of KC to have more of a voice in their policing process, not less, but there really wasn't that much discussion around the police chief himself.
And what about the living in the area, which I have argued around here, it does not make well for neighborhood policing if we're going to have them living over in Overland Park.
Right. I mean, that was what the whole debate was about. So Senator Tony Luetkemeyer is trying to make it so that police officers in Kansas City do not have to live in Kansas City. And he was successful in getting that as part of the police reform bill that passed out of the Senate. That's why I say it's a real mixed bag in terms of what left the Senate. That's SB 53.
And I will add to that a little bit. Senator Razor offered an amendment to restrict that so that at least the officers had to live in the state of Missouri. And Senator Razor ended up getting a roll call on that vote and got senators on record voting that they thought that Kansans should be able to police Missourians. It was unbelievable that people were willing to go on record that that was the way they should do that. But so his amendment was eventually defeated.
I would add, because the questions, a lot of the questions that I heard, there was either a why or that was implied in the question, like why did the governor not spend all the CARES Act money, which was over after he put 300 million into the unemployment insurance fund? Why weren't the rest of those funds spent on COVID relief for public health or whatever? I think one thing to always keep in mind about the why of many of these policies is just the fundamental disagreement about the role of government. And conservatives have a hard time with, for the most part, believing that government should have roles that many times when you talk about senators and representatives, that their constituents believe the government should have a role to play in those particular things, whether that's healthcare or CAFOs or whatever it may be. And so I think that's one way to look at the pandemic response, that there so much of it got caught up in these internal debates among conservatives about whether government should have such, as they would say, an expansive role in doing some of these things that I think we would clearly agree would be good for the, for public health and for our citizens. So, that's one thing to always keep in mind. A lot of the things and the policies that we see that don't make sense, they don't make sense from a policy perspective or from a legal perspective. But when you think about the ideology that drives some of the decisions, that's the only way to kind of understand why certain things are done or not done.
Yeah, Sean, I think that hits the nail on the head and also kind of gets to this question that Patricia is asking about the initiative petition process and the role of government and where conservatives are willing to step into a larger role of government if it means keeping citizens out of the role of government. And so Patricia had a question in here around, do you have any comments about the initiative petition bills that are making their way through the Senate? So those are a package of bills. There are about 20 of them. They, in general, try to do some of the following things. So they make it harder to qualify for the ballot by requiring you to collect signatures from every congressional district. They raise the vote threshold, making it harder to approve a statutory or constitutional change. They disqualify signatures if a judge changes the ballot title, or they remove a judge's ability to even review a ballot title, which we know the legislature and the Secretary of State have a tendency to manipulate to be very deceiving. And so all of those bills are hot to trot this year, headed before the Senate. And so you can track along with some of those. The numbers have been listed there: HB 333, HJR 20, HB 850. Those are some of them. They've had hearings in the Senate, so they will likely be coming to the floor of the Senate. And what I think is really insidious about those pieces of legislation is they basically say, we, your elected representative, always know best. We, the elected representative, don't think that you should have the right to put forward a resident-led ballot initiative to move Missouri in a direction that you think that we should head in. And so it really takes away the ability of residents and citizens to have a check on the government. And I think to Sean's point about how conservatives view the role of government, this is one of those areas where you see real hypocrisy, right? How could you say that it's not the government's job to assist people when it comes to something as basic as healthcare and COVID relief, but it is the government's job to exclude people from not only the ballot initiative process, but the right to vote overall. And I think that's what we see happen and again in the Missouri legislature is them really trying to circumscribe where the role of the people is in this process and remove some of our powers.
I'm glad you're addressing the why, because I just can't understand why they make decisions the way they do, like that Medicaid expansion. Why do they just resent helping people who are needy, and the food stamp program? It's a good thing that the bill just passed nationally will help families, because obviously Missouri legislators are not moved to do so. So with giving the extra money that's going to be given for parents with children will really help, since I guess one hand is giving, the other hand is taken away.
There was another question in chat about the American Rescue Plan related to gun violence prevention. I don't know specifically, maybe Sarah and Jeremy does, but a good group to follow, if you're not already following them, is Moms Demand Action on Gun Violence. They really do a very excellent job both at advocacy and also following those kinds of issues. So yeah, if we don't, if Sarah and Jeremy don't have more details about that, they may be somebody to reach out to get some answers.
And another group is Grandparents Against Gun Violence, but Every Town is another good group.
Well, I think it's my job to wrap us up and get us out the door. Is that right, Christine? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you all for joining us for this hour today. I appreciate that. I want to quickly plug for you. We did not, because of this real weird year, right? We have not done an advocacy day or invited people into the Capitol like we normally would, but we want to remind you that you are still integral to the process. And so we have decided to plan a week of action where we're going to cover sort of our 4 topic areas and invite people into.
Sarah, you muted yourself.
Oh my goodness, Jeremy, how long was I muted for?
Not very long.
Okay, good. So I wanted to make sure you're all aware of our week of actions that we have planned. We're just over the lunch hour. Join us for about an hour on the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd to learn about a policy priority and then practice legislative action with us that day. So it'll all be wrapped up in the 1 hour, and this will be a good chance for you to get engaged in some legislative advocacy if you haven't before. Further, we really want you to reach out and invite your networks, invite your agencies, invite your friends and family to join us as well. It's a really easy way for us to start to get involved. So it'll just be at noon each of those 4 days, and you can register at our website, which I provided in the chat box. Christine, did you have anything else?
No. The dates would be listed on our website of what days we're going to be focusing on what issues. So you can pick and choose which day you join us depending on the issue that you care about. So the link that Sarah shared should have all of that information on it.
Or join us all 4 days. It should not be
redundant.
Yes. It'll be worthwhile to join us all 4 days.
Yeah, and it's going to be a really kind of broad-based thing. We're going to explain the issue. We're going to explain advocacy. And so it'll be really great for folks who are involved in our coalitions, as well as people who have not really done much advocacy before, as a great kind of a short session to learn about advocacy and how to do that. So really, it'd be great to share this with folks who are like clients of yours, involved in your board of directors, other family and friends who may not be involved in much as advocacy as probably you all are. So definitely share this if there's an issue that you care about, or your family or your friends or your organization or your clients might be interested in. So we really hope that you can share this wide. Just a few other kind of wrap up things before we go. We do offer continuing education credits for these forums. If you are a social worker and you need that, I'm going to drop in the chat what you need to do if you want continuing education credits. You just need to send me an email with your name and your mailing address and your last 4 digits of your social security number, and then I'll get you the certificate. And then that link that I sent is just an evaluation form that we ask you if you could fill out. For continuing ed credits, you do need to fill out an evaluation form. All of you, I would love for you to fill out the evaluation form. Since we've kind of transitioned onto virtual, just getting some feedback on it would be really helpful. So that information is on there as well. We are hopeful to have a May forum that will focus more so on our federal level and what happens in DC and how it affects us. We're finalizing all the details of who we're going to have speak and what issues we're going to focus on. But that will be the first Friday in May. So put that on your calendar. We'll be right here doing a similar thing, but focusing on our federal level and its connections to us locally. So we hopefully you can join us in May for that as well. I don't have any other updates. Does anyone else have any other announcements or updates they'd like to share before we end? Nope. All right. Well, thank you all to our presenters. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. If you need to get any contact information for any of them, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share that. And the recording of this will be on our website soon as well, so you can share that with anyone who wasn't able to join us today. Thank you all so much. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.